silence broken. When Jake and I decided to go camping by a lake, we were both in desperate need of a break. Life had been chaotic, and the idea of spending a weekend away from it all, surrounded by nothing but nature, was too tempting to resist. The lake was a perfect spot, quiet, remote, and known for its stunning views. We'd heard that the lake was almost always deserted, making it ideal for a peaceful getaway. We arrived on a late Friday afternoon, the sun hanging low in the sky, casting golden hues across the water. The lake was as serene as we'd hoped, the surface still and glassy, reflecting the dense forest that surrounded it. The only sound was the occasional call of a bird or the rustling of leaves in the gentle breeze. It felt like a hidden paradise, untouched by the chaos of the world. We set up our tent a few feet from the shoreline, eager to relax and enjoy the tranquility. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, we had a campfire going and were roasting hot dogs, the scent mingling with the fresh pine in the air. We talked about everything and nothing, savoring the simple pleasure of just being away from it all. As night fell, the lake transformed. The darkness seemed thicker out here, the stars brighter, the silence almost too deep. The moon hung low, casting a pale light that shimmered on the lake's surface. It was peaceful, eerily so. After a while, we settled into our camp chairs, sipping beer and staring into the fire. It was the kind of silence that felt almost sacred, and we both fell into it, content to let the quiet wash over us. Then, out of nowhere, we heard it, a sound that shattered the stillness and sent a jolt of fear through both of us. It was a scream, high-pitched and unnatural, echoing across the lake. It was like nothing I had ever heard before, a mix of rage and anguish, a sound that seemed to come from deep within the earth itself. Jake and I froze, our eyes wide as we turned toward the direction of the sound. It had come from across the lake, from somewhere in the dense forest on the other side. But there was nothing there, nothing but darkness and trees. "What the hell was that?" Jake whispered, his voice shaking. I didn't have an answer. My heart was pounding in my chest, and every instinct told me to pack up and get out of there. But we were miles from the nearest town, and the thought of hiking back through the dark forest didn't exactly feel like a safe option either. "Maybe it was an animal," I suggested, though I didn't believe it myself. No animal could make a sound like that. Jake shook his head, his eyes still fixed on the dark shoreline across the lake. "That wasn't an animal, man. That was something else." We both stared at the lake, waiting, listening for any sign of movement. But the scream didn't come again. The forest was silent, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. "Let's just try to get some sleep," Jake said finally, though his voice lacked conviction. "We're probably just spooked because it's so quiet out here." Reluctantly, I nodded. We doused the fire, crawled into the tent, and zipped it up tight. But sleep didn't come easily. I kept hearing that scream in my head, that awful, inhuman wail that seemed to pierce right through me. Every time I started to drift off, I'd jolt awake, convinced I heard something moving outside. At some point, exhaustion finally won out, and I slipped into a restless sleep. I woke up suddenly in the middle of the night, my heart racing. For a moment, I couldn't figure out why, until I heard it again. The scream. This time it was closer, much closer, echoing through the trees on our side of the lake. "Jake, wake up!" I hissed, shaking him awake. He sat up, eyes wide with fear. "Did you hear that?" "Yeah, I whispered, my voice trembling. "It's here. Whatever it is, it's here." We both listened, straining to hear any other sounds, but the scream had faded, leaving only the oppressive silence behind. I could hear the blood pounding in my ears, every nerve on edge. Then we heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate, moving through the underbrush just outside our tent. They circled around us, coming closer, then stopping. We held our breath, too terrified to move. The footsteps were heavy, but they didn't sound like they belonged to a person. There was a dragging quality to them, like something was pulling itself along the ground. My mind raced with possibilities, none of them good. Suddenly, the tent walls started to shudder, as if something, or someone, was brushing against it. The fabric rippled, and for a moment, I thought I could see a shadow moving along the side, long and distorted, like a twisted reflection. Then, just as quickly as it had started, it stopped. The footsteps receded, fading into the night, leaving us in a silence so deep it felt suffocating. Neither of us moved or spoke for what felt like hours. Finally, Jake broke the silence. "We need to get out of here," he whispered, his voice barely audible. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. We quietly grabbed our flashlights and what little gear we could carry and unzipped the tent, stepping cautiously into the cold night air. The campsite was still, the lake calm, as if nothing had happened. But the air felt different, heavier, charged with something unseen. We didn't waste any time. We packed up quickly, our movements tense and hurried. I kept glancing around, half expecting to see something lurking in the shadows. But there was nothing. Just the dark trees and the reflection of the moon on the lake. As we started the hike back to the car, the silence pressed in around us, every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig making my heart jump. The scream echoed in my mind, that awful sound replaying over and over like a broken record. About halfway through the hike, Jake suddenly stopped, shining his flashlight into the trees. "Did you see that?" he whispered. I turned my flashlight in the same direction, but saw nothing, just trees and darkness. "See what?" I thought I saw something," he muttered, shaking his head. "Probably just my imagination." But I knew Jake well enough to know he wasn't imagining things. He was just as scared as I was, and at that moment I realized we weren't alone. Whatever had made that scream, whatever had circled our tent, was still out there, following us. We quickened our pace, our footsteps crunching on the forest floor, our breaths coming out in short, ragged gasps. I kept expecting to hear that scream again, to feel something reach out from the darkness and grab me. But the night remained silent. When we finally reached the car, we threw our gear into the trunk and jumped inside, locking the doors behind us. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking, and finally got the engine started. We peeled out of there, the tires kicking up dirt as we sped down the narrow road, desperate to put as much distance between us and that lake as possible. Neither of us spoke during the drive back. The silence between us was heavy, filled with unspoken fear. I could still hear the scream in my head, still feel the presence that had stalked us through the woods. We didn't talk about what happened after that. We tried to move on, to pretend it was just a bad dream, a trick of the mind. But deep down, we both knew the truth. That scream, that presence was real. Something dark and malevolent had found us that night by the lake, and it wasn't done with us. Even now, I sometimes wake up in the middle of the night, heart pounding, convinced I can hear that scream echoing in the distance. and every time, I wonder if whatever was out there is still watching, still waiting for the right moment to strike. Because some things don't just stay in the woods, they follow you home. The Man in the Woods. I grew up in a small town, the kind where everyone knows everyone, and nothing exciting ever really happens. It was the sort of place where people left their doors unlocked, and the biggest news was when old Mrs. Harper's cat went missing for the 3rd time that month. The town was surrounded by dense forests, and as kids, we used to play in the woods, building forts and daring each other to venture deeper than anyone else had before. There was a particular area of the woods that we avoided, though. It was a patch of land where the trees grew too close together, their branches intertwining like skeletal fingers, blocking out the sunlight even on the brightest of days. We called it the Dark Place. There were stories about it, of course. Every small town has its ghost stories. But we never paid them much mind. It was just a creepy part of the woods, nothing more. Or so we thought. It was late October, just a few days before Halloween when it happened. My friends and I were out in the woods, doing what boys do, when one of us, Tommy, the bravest of the bunch, suggested we finally explore the Dark Place. I remember the look on his face, a mix of excitement and fear. We all hesitated, but none of us wanted to be the one to back out, so we agreed. As we made our way toward the Dark Place, the air seemed to grow colder, the trees denser, as if the forest itself was trying to keep us out. The closer we got, the quieter it became. No birds chirping, no rustling of leaves, just an eerie, suffocating silence. When we reached the edge of the Dark Place, I felt a shiver run down my spine. The trees were so close together that it was almost impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. The ground was covered in a thick layer of leaves, and the air smelled of damp earth and decay. Tommy took the lead, pushing through the underbrush, and the rest of us followed. We hadn't gone far when we heard it, a low, deep growl, like the sound of a large animal. We froze, our hearts pounding in our chests. The growl came again, this time closer, and we realized with a sickening dread that it was coming from somewhere within the Dark Place. We turned to run, but as we did, we saw him, a tall figure standing among the trees, barely visible in the dim light. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes were sunken, dark pits that seemed to stare right through us. He wore tattered clothes, covered in mud and leaves, and his hair was long and matted. But it was his face that terrified me the most, a twisted, grotesque mask of rage and pain, as if he had been suffering for a very long time. We bolted, crashing through the underbrush, not daring to look back. The growling grew louder, closer, and I could hear footsteps behind me, heavy and fast. My heart felt like it was going to explode out of my chest, but I kept running, fueled by sheer terror. We didn't stop until we were out of the woods, back in the safety of our neighborhood. We collapsed on the ground, gasping for breath, too scared to speak. When we finally caught our breath, we looked at each other, and I knew we were all thinking the same thing. We had to tell someone. But who would believe us? A man living in the woods, growling like a beast. It sounded ridiculous, even to us. So we made a pact, a promise to never tell what we saw, to pretend it never happened. We kept that promise too. But that night changed something in all of us. We never went back to the Dark Place, and we stopped playing in the woods altogether. Years passed, and I moved away. But I never forgot about that night. Sometimes, in the dead of night, I would dream about those dark, twisted trees and the man who lurked among them. And then a few months ago, I got a call from Tommy. He sounded different, shaken. He told me that they had found a body in the woods, right near the dark place. A hiker, they said, who had gone missing months ago. The body was so badly decomposed that they could hardly identify it, but the police ruled it an animal attack. But Tommy didn't believe that. He said the way the body was found, the way the bones were broken, it wasn't an animal. It was something else. Something worse. I didn't know what to say. We both knew what he was implying, but neither of us wanted to admit it. After all these years, the memory of that night had faded, but now it was back, clearer than ever. I hung up the phone, a cold sweat breaking out on my forehead. I knew I would never go back to that town, never go near those woods again. But I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was in the dark place was still there, waiting. And I couldn't help but wonder how many others had ventured into that forest and never returned. The growling haunts me, even now. It's the last thing I hear before I fall asleep, and the first thing I hear when I wake up. And I know, deep down, that the dark place isn't done with us yet. It's waiting, biding its time, and one day, it'll come for us all. Cursed campsite. It was supposed to be a simple camping trip, just a weekend away to clear our heads and enjoy some time in nature. The group consisted of me, my best friend Chris, and our girlfriends Emmy and Julia. We'd been talking about this trip for weeks, planning it down to the last detail. We picked a secluded spot deep in the pines, miles away from the nearest town. We wanted peace and quiet, a break from the hustle of daily life. But what we found in those woods was something we never could have prepared for. We arrived at the campsite in the late afternoon. The sun was still high, casting long shadows through the dense forest. The air was crisp, filled with the scent of pine and earth. We pitched our tents, gathered firewood, and set up a circle of stones to contain our campfire. Everything was perfect, exactly as we'd imagined it. By the time night fell, we had a roaring fire going. We cooked hot dogs, toasted marshmallows, and swapped stories as the stars began to dot the sky. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. The kind of silence that makes you feel like the whole world has disappeared, leaving you alone with only your thoughts. As the night wore on, the temperature dropped, and the fire became our only source of warmth. We all huddled close, our conversations slowing to a comfortable lull. But as the fire crackled, I started to feel uneasy, like we were being watched. I shook it off, chalking it up to being out in the middle of nowhere. "Anyone else feel like it's too quiet?" Chris asked, breaking the silence. He was staring into the woods, his brow furrowed. Emmy laughed, trying to lighten the mood. "We're in the middle of nowhere, Chris. What did you expect? Traffic noise?" "I don't know. It just feels off," Chris muttered, poking the fire with a stick. I knew what he meant. It was quiet. Too quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, not even the sound of insects. Just the crackling of the fire and the occasional pop of burning wood. But I didn't want to feed into his paranoia, so I just shrugged. "It's the woods, man. Relax." Chris nodded, but I could tell he wasn't convinced. We tried to get back to our conversations, but the mood had shifted. The laughter had died down, and a sense of unease settled over us like a blanket. It was Emmy who heard it first, a faint rustling sound, just beyond the circle of light cast by our fire. She stiffened, her eyes darting toward the darkness. Did you hear that?" We all went quiet, listening. At first, there was nothing, just the crackle of the fire. Then there it was again, a soft rustling, like something moving through the underbrush. "It's probably just an animal," I said, trying to sound confident. But even as I said it, I wasn't sure. It didn't sound like any animal I'd ever heard. "Maybe we should check it out," Julia suggested, though her voice was uncertain. Chris shook his head. "No way. If it's just an animal, it'll go away. If it's something else, well, better not to find out." We all nodded in agreement, but the tension in the air was palpable. We tried to ignore it, to go back to our conversations, but the rustling kept coming, closer each time. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. For a moment, we all sat in silence, straining to hear anything, but the only sound was the crackling fire. The silence was oppressive, like a heavy weight pressing down on us. I could see the fear in everyone's eyes, though no one wanted to admit it. "I think we should call it a night," Emmy said finally, her voice trembling slightly. No one argued. We doused the fire, packed away the food, and retreated to our tents. Chris and I shared one tent, while Emmy and Julia shared the other. We zipped up the flaps and settled into our sleeping bags, but sleep didn't come easily. I kept listening for that rustling sound, for anything that might suggest we weren't alone. Hours passed, and I was finally starting to drift off when I heard it. A soft, rhythmic tapping. I sat up, my heart pounding in my chest, and realized the sound was coming from outside our tent. I glanced at Chris, who was already wide awake, his eyes wide with fear. "Do you hear that?" he whispered. I nodded, too scared to speak. The tapping continued, steady and deliberate, as if someone or something was walking around our campsite. "What the hell is that?" Chris muttered, his voice shaking. I didn't answer. I didn't know what it was, and I didn't want to find out. The tapping grew louder, circling our tent. I could hear it moving around the campsite, passing by the girls' tent, then coming back toward us. My mind raced with possibilities. Was it an animal? A person? Something else? Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the tapping stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, the kind that makes your ears ring. I held my breath, straining to hear anything that might give us a clue as to what was out there. Suddenly, a loud thump echoed through the campsite, followed by a dragging sound. It was close, too close. Chris and I exchanged terrified looks, neither of us daring to move. The dragging sound grew louder, as if something heavy was being pulled across the ground. My heart was racing, and I could feel cold sweat trickling down my spine. Whatever it was right outside our tent. Then came a whisper, so soft I almost missed it. "Let us in." I froze. The voice was faint, almost childlike, but there was something wrong with it, something inhuman. I glanced at Chris, his face pale with fear. He had heard it too. "We need to get out of here," Chris whispered, his voice trembling. I nodded, but I had no idea how we were supposed to leave without whatever was out there noticing us. I reached for my phone, but there was no signal. We were completely cut off. Another thump, followed by that same dragging sound. It was right next to our tent now, so close I could almost feel it. I held my breath, listening as the sound moved slowly past us, heading toward the girls' tent. I wanted to warn them, to tell them to stay quiet, but I couldn't risk making a sound. Then out of nowhere, the sound stopped again. The silence was suffocating. and I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. Finally, I worked up the courage to unzip the tent just enough to peek outside. The campsite was empty. No sign of anything unusual. The fire was out, and the moon cast long shadows across the clearing. "I think it's gone," I whispered to Chris, though I wasn't sure if I believed it myself. Chris nodded, but neither of us moved. We were both too scared to leave the safety of the tent. Then, just as I was about to zip the tent back up, I saw it. A dark figure standing at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the trees. It was tall and thin, with eyes that seemed to glow in the dark. It was watching us, its head cocked to one side, as if curious. I froze, unable to look away. The figure took a step forward, then another, moving slowly toward the tent. My breath caught in my throat, and I felt a wave of pure terror wash over me. It was coming for us. Without thinking, I grabbed Chris and yanked him out of the tent. "Run!" I shouted, my voice cracking with fear. We bolted out of the tent, sprinting toward the car as fast as we could. The girls must have heard us, because they burst out of their tent too, panic written all over their faces. We didn't stop, didn't look back, just ran. I could hear footsteps behind us, heavy and fast, as if something was chasing us, but I didn't dare turn around. All I could think about was getting to the car, getting out of those woods. We reached the car, and I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking. Finally, I got the door open, and we all piled inside. I slammed the door shut and locked it just as the figure emerged from the trees. It stood there, watching us with those glowing eyes, its head still tilted to one side. For a moment, I thought it might come after us, but then it simply turned and vanished back into the woods, disappearing into the shadows. We didn't waste any time. I started the car and floored it, tearing down the dirt road as fast as I could. No one spoke. We were all too shaken, too terrified by what we had just experienced. It wasn't until we were miles away, back on the highway, that I finally let myself breathe. I glanced at Chris, who was pale and shaking, and then at the girls, who were huddled together in the back seat, their faces etched with fear. "What the hell was that?" Emmy whispered, her voice trembling. I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that we had encountered something in those woods, something that didn't belong in this world. And as we drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. That whatever it was, that dark figure with its glowing eyes and unnatural movements, had marked us. As the miles passed, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see it following us, lurking in the shadows of the trees lining the road. But the darkness behind us remained empty, save for the occasional flicker of our taillights reflecting off the distant trees. We finally pulled into the driveway of Chris and Emmy's house, our temporary sanctuary, at just past dawn. The soft light of early morning did little to chase away the terror of the previous night. We sat in the car, still silent, still shaken, none of us eager to break the fragile calm that had settled over us. Chris was the first to speak. "What do we do now?" His voice was rough, like he'd been screaming for hours, though I knew it was just fear making him sound that way. "We need to stay together," I said, my voice firm, trying to impose some sense of control on the situation. Whatever that thing was, it might still be out there, watching us. Julia, who had been holding on to Emmy as if she were a lifeline, nodded in agreement. "We can't go back to those woods," she said. "We can't ever go back." We all agreed, Going back wasn't an option, but neither was staying in that house forever. Eventually, we'd have to move on, but for now, the idea of stepping outside felt like tempting fate. We spent the next few days holed up in Chris and Emmy's house, too afraid to leave. We tried to rationalize what had happened, coming up with theories that ranged from elaborate pranks to hallucinations brought on by the isolation of the woods. But deep down, we all knew the truth. Something had found us in those woods, something unnatural, and it had no intention of letting us go. On the third night, I woke up to the sound of tapping at the window. My heart froze, and for a moment, I thought I was back in the tent, reliving that nightmare. But then I remembered where I was, safe, inside the house, far from the woods. Or so I thought. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. I turned my head slowly, dreading what I might see, and there it was, a silhouette standing outside the window, tall and thin, with glowing eyes peering through the glass. It was the figure from the woods, standing just feet away from me, separated only by a thin pane of glass. My breath caught in my throat as the figure leaned closer, its face nearly pressed against the window. Those glowing eyes bore into me, filled with a malice I could feel deep in my bones. And then, in a voice that was barely more than a whisper, I heard it speak. "Let me in." I bolted upright, heart pounding, and for a moment I thought I was still dreaming. But the figure was gone, the window clear, and all that remained was the sound of my own ragged breathing. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night, and when morning finally came, I told the others what I had seen. They didn't doubt me. They had all felt the presence too, lurking just out of sight, waiting for its moment. We made the decision then and there to leave. We packed our things, avoiding the windows, and drove to a different town, far from the woods, far from where we'd encountered that thing. But even now, months later, I still feel it sometimes. The sense that I'm being watched, that glowing eyes are following me from the darkness. We thought we could escape it by leaving the woods, by never returning to that cursed campsite. But I know better now. It's still out there, waiting, watching, and it will never stop hunting us. Not until we let it in. Hope you enjoyed the fright. Bloody subscribe to avoid the horrors lurking in the night. Sweet dreams.